Hello, today on my channel you will hear an amazing story about life. I hope you enjoy this story. This one struck me to the core. Honestly, I still can't forget it. Enjoy watching.
Joe had always known what he wanted to be for as long as he could remember. Even as a child, at a very early age, he had only one favorite game. Arranging different toys in front of him, he imagined that they were students and he was a university professor giving them an incredibly difficult but very exciting lecture. The university in these dreams took far from accidental, because Joe was to become a hereditary teacher. Almost his entire family was part of the professorial staff of one higher education institution or another, except for the exception of his mother's older sister. She was a school teacher, and therefore among the relatives was considered not too talented person. It is unlikely that with such input data the boy could think of any other dream. Nevertheless, in his case, it was not just a tribute to family tradition. He was really good at teaching, at explaining and engaging. In short, he had a real talent for teaching, which had also manifested itself as a child. Of course, it was later in life. When young Joe was 5, he had a little brother. The boy took it very coolly. He was not jealous, as many children, but also did not show any interest in the new child, as if it was not a living person at all, but some piece of furniture and quite familiar and ordinary. Everything changed not even at the moment when Barry began to speak, but a little later when he grew to the age of witches and began to actively ask questions. And quite quickly it became clear that to address them to his parents, in general, it is useless. They, of course, tried to answer his son, but clearly not in terms that would be available to the understanding of a 5-year-old boy. And then Barry, tired of the situation, turned to his brother and suddenly found that it was absolutely the right decision. Of course, Joe didn't know much at that time, but he already had excellent skills of searching for information and great patience, so he had no trouble finding answers for the younger boy, which he was waiting for. He presented them in a clear and accessible language. At school, Joe often helped his classmates and even older kids. Of course, he didn't let anyone cheat, but he was always ready to show and clearly explain complex material. Many children went to his impromptu classes much more willingly than to the mandatory lessons to adult teachers, and he was even given the appropriate nickname of Professor. Of course, those who came up with it, hoping somehow to poke overly talented and arrogant kid. However, to their surprise, Joe was not embarrassed in the slightest. On the contrary, only became even prouder and soon stopped responding to any other treatment. Much more difficult was given to the boy, the choice of discipline which he would like to teach, or at least the general direction of the branch of science which he wished to study. He seemed to be interested in absolutely everything in the world. Any information sat in his memory. He never seemed to forget anything. And all this pile of facts from various scientific fields was necessary and interesting to him. How does a flower work? Which star is the brightest in the night sky? How do you set up a spectacular but safe chemistry experiment? He had the answers to all these questions, and 1 million more of the same, from his point of view, simple and interesting. But how to choose something from all this variety, he could not imagine. And what is worse, none of the adults were able to answer this question. None of them simply never had the need to make such a choice. But they knew from the beginning exactly what they wanted to study, and teaching was like a burden. It wasn't important in itself. In the end, Joe, who struggled for several years to enter the university, made a willful decision and went to study biology. Then, however, he thought about getting a second degree and again faced a difficult choice. All the same wonderful opportunities opened up in front of him as before. In the end, the young man decided that he needed something radically different from the first specialty and entered the philological school, which he graduated from as successfully as the biological one. And after all this, he went to teach as a medical doctor, having taken a number of additional courses. However, by and large, Joe started teaching from the second year of his first faculty. His talents could not go unnoticed, and he was allowed to teach some elective classes. Theoretically, they were intended for freshmen and high school students. In practice, many 5th and 6th year students and even some teachers went to his lectures. The young man was prophesied a bright future, a brilliant career, and he did not deceive these hopes. He was elected rector incredibly early. The man was not yet 35. Nevertheless, the professors, many of whom were older than him by almost half a century, decided that they simply could not find a better candidate for this position. That's how, having appeared in the walls of the university as a boy in 15 years, he became the most important person here. Probably, someone else would be happy and even united. Few people manage to get such power at such a young age, and few would be wise enough not to abuse it. Joe's joy was short-lived, however, only until he realized that the honorary position of rector meant less time for teaching and much more of the unbearable bureaucratic red tape he had always disliked. And doing his own supplementary education, which he never stopped doing for a minute, became much more difficult. Joe even considered giving up the honorary position, even though it would have offended his colleagues. However, there were considerations that prevented him from doing so. First and foremost, of course, his parents. They would definitely not understand if their son was given such an honor. Having reached such heights, which no one from their family had ever dreamed of, took, and would have sent it all to a known address. And besides, there was one major advantage to being rector: access to a huge library where you could find quite rare books. It was not easy to get a book in the library, let alone a book in hand. Not every professor could count on such luck. The point, of course, was not in any special secrecy, but in the same terrible bureaucracy. Of course, all requests were sooner or later satisfied, unless, of course, they were lost under a pile of other equally useless papers. But they went through the Ministry of Education, and therefore could go a very winding path. And it is not a fact that when you get the permission you are looking for, you will want to read something. But for university rectors, this path was reduced several times. By and large, you could say that they had almost free access to this repository. That, of course, was a great incentive for Joe, though he realized that he wouldn't have too much time to make use of such a treasure. But anyhow, when he was completely overwhelmed by his new responsibilities, it didn't seem right to give them up, no matter how one looked at it, and the time limit wasn't very long. It was possible to be patient and not to agree to take this place at least one more time for the good of the world. That's what he told his colleagues. True, they took these words as an ordinary professional coquetry, and they didn't take them very seriously. Let's see how he will talk when his re-election happens, and almost no one doubted that it would really happen. And with other candidates in the university was somehow tense. The entire faculty was represented by two categories of people: decrepit old men who were simply incapable of performing the necessary functions, or as young as Joe, but much more talented and responsible people. Among the latter, there was a competitor for the young rector. He was a bit older than the main candidate and considered it his undeniable advantage. He had more experience, and the desire to do serious things instead of talking to silly students and constantly disappearing in the library. Of course, such agitation could not inspire or convince anyone, all the more so because Joe, despite his declared dissatisfaction with his position, was doing an excellent job. In such a strange position, the university approached the next academic year, at the end of which the election of a new rector was scheduled. In the meantime, Joe had managed to adjust his schedule so that he could combine as much teaching work as possible. He was now teaching 3 classes a week, one of which was freshmen. For some reason, he always liked working with them more than with everyone else. Perhaps it was because, deep down, he didn't want to teach at the university. He was more attracted to working with children than with almost grown-up people. He often caught himself thinking that it was much more comfortable and interesting for him to study with his classmates or answer his younger brother's questions than to lecture to students. These thoughts, however, he drove away from him before he had time to realize them properly. He himself was not fully aware that he was not really in his place. As soon as such thoughts entered his head, they were immediately interrupted by the thunderous, well-pitched voice of his father. "Lily is your embarrassment to the whole family. A school teacher. That's a load of crap. What potential does she have?" His mother echoed him. "You wouldn't believe it. She was a better student than me. What happened to her? I can't imagine." And Joe would forget all about working with kids. His parents wouldn't have understood him. And even then before, maybe he could be seen as an incapable loser like Aunt Lily. But now, after the progress he'd made, that path was closed off forever. Joe. This time it wasn't his own memories that interrupted his thoughts, but a haunting voice. Joe. He looked in front of him with a more meaningful gaze. He was standing behind the lectern in an auditorium literally filled with freshmen. They were all looking at him with a mixture of interest and some anxiety. Very close by, placing a hand on his shoulder, was a very pretty young girl. "Yes, I'm sorry, for God's sake," she gibbered. It's just that your lecture should have started 5 minutes ago, and you're still not talking. Is everything okay? Yeah, thank you. Casey. She introduced herself quickly. Thank you. Casey, I'm fine. Have a seat. Now, gentlemen of the class, if you'll excuse me, I've been thinking a little bit about the topic of our class today. A lot of teachers start off with a lot of abstruse stuff. They think it'll be more interesting that way. Or maybe they just want to show that they can be real professionals. Today, I want to talk to you as adults, but still very young people who are just finding their way in life. So today, I will tell you about what the profession of biologist is, what these people actually do. What career heights can you achieve? Perhaps some of you will realize after this that you chose the wrong specialty. There's nothing wrong with that. Trust me, it's better now than 4 or 5 years from now. Casey, are you all right? And only now Joe noticed that the girl was still standing near his desk and looking at him with a very strange look. It made the teacher very uncomfortable. Oh, and I'm sorry, I was just listening. You are so fascinating, she said hastily. With that, Casey waved somewhere in the classroom, and Joe felt as if he could breathe a little easier. She didn't go far though, sitting on the front row and continuing to devour him with her eyes. The man tried not to look in her direction. True, a couple times during the lecture, when he asked some leading questions, she pulled her hand so hard that it was not nice not to ask her. No need to come to the board, Casey, answer from your seat. He was already starting to get annoyed, though he tried very hard not to show it to the students. What was wrong with this girl after all? Why was she acting so strangely? Joe couldn't find any answers to these questions, but for the first time in his life, he was genuinely glad when the lecture was over. Joe, why are you so excited? A colleague, with whom he had shared this unpleasant incident, asked at lunch. They're freshmen, so what do you think? Overexcited. The girl wants to be an excellent student. She wants to prove herself somehow. She's doing her best. I guess you're right. Joe sighed. Well, of course, when they have your next bear in a week, you see, will sit quiet as a mouse somewhere in the back corner in the classroom and embarrassed by his behavior today. Yeah, never mind. Yeah, I guess I shouldn't. Joe Stepanovich stretched out. He was not so sure of this development of events, although it would have pleased him much more. The man himself did not understand what it was that made him suspicious of the girl's behavior, but he was used to trusting his instincts, which were now screaming with all their might about the impropriety, even the abnormality of the whole situation. What are you really so worked up about? Joe said sternly to himself. Rocky's right, there's nothing wrong. Just the usual excitement of a newly enrolled student. After all, you're the one who started the lecture with some stupid musings that had nothing to do with the subject. A week later, however, things got even worse. Casey did not hurry to sit at the back of the desk and hide her eyes from the teacher. On the contrary, she was sitting in front again, and in a seat from which Joe could see the depth of her cleavage. This depth, it must be said, was absolutely indecent. The girl now and then drew the teacher's attention to herself. Then she would make some absolutely ridiculous sign. Then she would ask a question, then drop a pencil right under his feet. Then she would think of something else. Somehow Joe was sure it was all on purpose, even though he tried to keep such thoughts out of his mind. Maybe the girl was really just trying too hard, but the further it went, the worse the situation got with each couple. She was acting more and more brazenly. The neckline of her blouse became more and more provocative. She, it turned out, was disturbing not only Joe, but the whole course. However, that didn't stop her in the slightest. Eventually, the instructor decided she couldn't go on like this. Casey, come to my office after class, once said Cassie, choosing from his arsenal of teachers' intonations as serious as possible. I thought you'd never invite me. The girl retorted to the laughter of some of her classmates. Joe turned away from her and ignored her for the rest of the class. Perhaps the same tactics would be needed here as with the school bullies. If they realized you didn't care about their antics, they'd let it go. But it didn't work. Attempts to attract the attention of teachers by any means continued until the bell rang. The man expected Casey to ignore his request to come to him after class. After all, it was clearly this girl's goal to piss him off. He knew the kind of students whose main goal in life was to make the teacher mad. And in the university in this regard, there's a lot of room. Parents wouldn't be summoned, and they wouldn't be expelled, at least not until you fail the session or blow up the dean's office. However, the latter was no guarantee either. Joe knew that from his own experience, not as a teacher, but as a student. He, however, did not pursue hooligan motives, but acted solely in the name of science. Besides, except for the deputy dean's coat, no one had been hurt. And Casey hasn't been harmed yet. Why are you so angry with her? The man thought in confusion. Did you distinguish yourself by good behavior? At her age. To his surprise, at 5:30 in the evening, someone knocked quietly on his office door, if not scraped through it. So quiet and uncertain was the sound. Joe didn't even think it might be Casey. She probably would have kicked the door down even if she had come in. Still, he was wrong, and it was her. You asked to come in, Joe, the girl said in a surprisingly quiet, colorless voice. Yes, I did. Why are you acting so insecure? Are you sure it's Casey, or did she send her twin sister? It's me, Joe, just. She sobbed. What's Casey? The teacher's tone instantly became softer and calmer. However, nothing could stop the disaster that had begun. In the middle of the classroom, the girl was sobbing at the top of her voice. Joe, like many men, had no idea what to do in such a situation. Casey, I'm begging you to calm down. Why are you crying over nothing, really? It's not a big deal. It's a teacher's appointment. You know how many times I've been summoned to the rector's office over the years. Have you been summoned too? And I was expelled from the university right at the beginning of my freshman year. And I wanted to be a real biologist so badly. Casey, wait, I didn't summon you as a rector. I summoned you as a teacher, who, I'll be honest with you, I admit, is in the way of my classes. Nevertheless, if all students were expelled for something like this, there would be absolutely no one left to study. If Joe had hoped that his words would calm Casey, he was sorely mistaken. She sobbed even louder and shriller than before, though it had seemed to the man before that such a thing was basically impossible. But what he had said was wrong. She should have been happy with the news that no one was going to expel her from the university. Wasn't she? Go and understand these women, even if they're still very young. What do they want? They say one thing, but in fact, in their minds, which is completely different. And how to understand that it is these other men somehow guess? Well, or more or less, at least in half of cases. Well, or a little less, but that's not the point. He never guessed. Maybe it was because Joe just didn't have the right experience. All his life, he'd been studying, teaching, babysitting his younger brother, reading books. Now he was a rector, and almost the youngest in the history of the university. What to think about women, let alone socialize with them. I knew it. I knew I was a nuisance. I'm a nuisance to everyone. I'm always trouble. Joe, sighing, realized his mistake. The phrase about how no one was going to expel her, the girl just hadn't heard it, latching onto his words that could have sounded like an accusation. It was as if she was purposely feeding her own sadness, building it up, and using anything for that purpose. As the saying goes, anything you say can be used against you. Joe thought grimly. Maybe she should have gone to law school. Casey, look, that's not what I meant. You're a very nice girl, and I'm sure there are objective reasons for your behavior. The only reason I called you here is to help you deal with them, and also to make our interaction more comfortable and productive for all parties. You think I'm cute? Casey perked up immediately. Joe Stepanovich once again found himself in a quandary. The question was kind of slippery. It was not a nice one. To say no would offend her. She would start crying again because she had almost stopped crying. But to answer in the affirmative would mean to put herself in an awkward position. I don't know how his phrase could be interpreted. What kind of a fool is that? The man scolded himself. Are you going to be careful how you use that phrase? Well, try to pick up here, when in the middle of the room stands a young girl and roaring in 3 streams, preventing you from collecting your thoughts. In such a situation, you'll say anything to make this horror finally end. But to carefully choose words somehow still not handy. Besides, there was another circumstance that Joe was afraid to admit even to himself. But he was still a man, and a young one at that, and he had no complaints about his eyesight. It was impossible not to recognize that the girl standing in front of him was really quite charming. And besides, she was dressed in such a way that all the advantages of her figure were maximally emphasized, and all the flaws, if there were any, respectively, carefully hidden. Of course, this was not what the teacher had in mind, calling his troubled student to a conversation. Nevertheless, such observations were taking place somewhere deep in Joe's subconscious, almost without the input of his mind. Some ancient instincts were awakening in him as he looked at Casey. One of them, strangely enough, turned out to be a desire to protect and shield her from all sorts of problems and difficulties. Come to think of it, that reaction was quite natural. But after all, she was crying. It was as if it showed her vulnerability and defenselessness, but surprisingly, it didn't give her any childishness. On the contrary, she now seemed even older to Joe than she really was. Well, at last he stretched out, unable to endure her waiting gaze any longer. I can see that you're a diligent student and quite intelligent. And apparently, because of that you're very nervous, which is why you're so nervous. So you take back what you said about Hugh? Casey asked insistently, not shy to interrupt the teacher. Why, a lot of freshmen could be characterized that way, and you're no exception. Joe thought he had found a very elegant way out of the situation. It was as if he hadn't retracted his compliment, but the way he phrased it, it no longer sounded ambiguous. It was just a detached, nostalgia-filled talk of the rector about the new generation of students. Casey, however, did not like the wording at all. She sobbed again even more, loudly and serenely. However, despite the sobs and moans, the phrases the girl was uttering and quite clearly. Okay, so I'm just like everyone else to you. Have you really learned nothing in the month I've known you? Continuing to sob, Casey exclaimed, is she thinking counting? Casey, to be honest, I really don't understand what you want me to do, he said, firmly dropping the familiar tone. And I'd appreciate it if you'd explain it to me. You again, she remarked. Joe sensed a change. Quite abruptly, Casey stopped crying, though her voice was still visibly trembling, but she spoke no longer with sadness and with some anger or perhaps rage. You're all the same. No one ever understands me. Explain it to him, you see. How can I explain anything to you if you can't think of such a simple thing? I thought you invited me tonight because you finally understood. Did you? Her voice broke into a wail again. Casey, please calm down, Joe pleaded. Yes, that's how stupid I am. I don't understand the simplest things, but maybe you can explain to me the essence of your problem, and we'll think together what we can do about it. The essence of my problem is that I fell in love with an absolutely callous and senseless egoist who doesn't notice anything around him except his biology. With these words, she suddenly rushed to the door and slammed it shut from the outside. For some time longer, Joe heard her retreating footsteps interspersed with sobs. He hardly seemed to care about them, though. Stunned, he stood in the middle of his office, trying to make sense of what he had just heard. Had he gotten it right this time? Better not. Only a student in love with him and a freshman was not enough to make him happy. When did she do that? They just met, or was she some kind of love at first sight? Joe had honestly thought there was no such thing. But now he wasn't so sure. What was he supposed to do in this situation? He couldn't leave the university because of it, could he? And you can't kick her out either. Why, you ask, why would he feel that way? Is she capable of doing anything to them? It's not like she fell in love with the most unsuitable person on purpose. In the end, after thinking properly, Joe found, as it seemed to him, a rather good way out. Without delay, he called to him the dean of the Faculty of Biology and told him, of course, without details of the essence of his request, Joe. The dean answered him, "You'll excuse me, of course, but are you kidding me? You specifically asked me to give you this particular pair of first-year students. Now you changed your mind a month later. Now where am I gonna find a teacher who's willing to do that? Well, everyone's busy enough as it is. Well, I could switch with someone," suggested the rector so timidly as if he was talking to his boss, and not vice versa. "We could try, but hardly anyone would agree to it. Nobody likes the first year, and I think you're beginning to see why." Joe sighed again and let the dean go. Of course, many people in his place would think that they didn't care about the problems of their subordinates. The rector said we should switch him with someone, so we take him and change him forcibly. But alas, he couldn't do that. His conscience would not allow him to use his official position so brazenly, in fact, for personal purposes. His only hope now was that Casey herself would realize that her feelings were unrequited and they were not destined to become a couple. So maybe she would stop her subversive activities and just study. And there, look, we'll meet some cute boy, or maybe a high school student, and think, we'll forget about the rector, who is fit to be her father. In any case, he couldn't think of any other way to solve the problem, and having decided that the morning was wiser than the evening, he went home. In the morning, however, new bright thoughts did not hurry to visit his head. The next day they did not come either, nor the one that followed. Joe struggled to get through the next week. The worries and fears would not leave him, paralyzing his thought process. He didn't know what kind of antics to expect from a student in love. Nevertheless, even his modest experience was enough to realize his idealistic options, in which everything would resolve itself, hardly had any chance of materializing. On Tuesday, he entered the auditorium with bated breath, expecting to see absolutely anything there. There was silence in the room, however. Incomplete, of course. There is no such thing as perfect silence in a place where a large number of people, much less students, congregate. Sure, someone was rustling inspections, someone was chatting, someone was pretending to be paper balls, but his appearance was not accompanied, as usual, by Casey's caustic commentary. Looking around the audience, Joe clearly realized exactly what that was about. The girl was simply not in the room, which of course was alarming in itself. Well, what she never allowed herself was to be late or truant. Of course, Joe was glad that no one was interfering with his date or trying to disrupt it, but he was troubled by a vague uneasiness. Had he tried to push the thought away with the girl, but it came back to his mind again and again stubbornly. Who knows these young girls? There was no telling what might have crossed their minds. Nevertheless, he took no action on the matter. Well, decided after all, to skip his in principle, normal explainable behavior. Maybe it would even be good for her if she didn't see him for a while. And as for the new material, she'd pick it up somehow. This was not a school, after all, where attendance was often prioritized over everything else, including the knowledge gained by the student. The next week, however, Joe's anxiety only increased. He caught himself looking for the familiar redhead in the corridors of the university and did not see her, as if she had decided not to attend not only his classes, but none at all. Sure enough, and at his next pair of classes, the girl was again absent. Joe felt himself starting to feel panic take over him beyond his will. What was it, after all? She couldn't have decided to drop out of university because of this unfortunate misunderstanding. And if she did, then what is it? It's his fault that the girl won't get a decent education. And how do you suggest he live with that? Things got worse the following week. Joe couldn't stop thinking about Casey, and to his dismay and bewilderment, those thoughts occasionally went to the wrong place. He remembered the smell of her perfume and the way she looked in that blouse with the too deep neckline, and he'd even caught himself thinking that it had been quite attractive. He remembered her charming smile and her short skirt. He remembered how pleasant her voice had actually sounded, even in those moments when she'd voiced things that weren't too flattering to him. Remembered, after all, how she called him a senseless egomaniac who was only interested in his biology, and mentally argued. That wasn't true, after all. He was interested in a lot of things in his life. All right, he would be interested if he had the time. But where would he get the time when he was constantly busy with work and school? My God, she was right, he concluded dejectedly. The thought struck him so sharply and so suddenly that he even stopped in the middle of the hallway, creating a small traffic jam of students rushing to lunch. They all grumbled at him, not paying any attention to the fact that the rector himself was in front of them. Many of them hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning, and at the moment they were not interested in anything but the desire to fill their stomachs as soon as possible. But in every uncooperative face, Joe saw Casey. It was she who was grudgingly pushing forcefully, demanding that they move out of the way and let her through to the dining room. She said over and over again that he was selfish. Right now, for example, he stood in the middle of the hallway with his stupid musings and won't let the poor students eat. How could he do such a thing? Would a person who has even a shred of conscience do such a thing? Just like that, without thinking about how it would look, Joe shook his head sharply. Everything was back to normal. The students stopped taking in Casey's appearance. Some of them squinted at him with surprise and disbelief. He understood them perfectly well. Standing in the middle of the hallway, shaking it off like a dog swatting, thank goodness. They couldn't know that. His own hallucinations. The man realized he was starting to lose his mind, and the other thing was that he missed Casey. Worried about her and had no idea what he'd do if the girl didn't show up at his next pairing. He realized it was the most wrong thing that could ever happen to him, but there seemed to be nothing he could do about it anymore. As could be expected in the next class, she was not in the classroom again. Joe did his best as usual. But it was his usual lecture. It was boring, even sluggish. Even the best students of the course occasionally caught themselves that his hand was leaning against the notebook, and his eyes began to droop against his will. They, of course, immediately restrained themselves, but still could not understand what was going on with their favorite teacher. He, in turn, did not think at all about the material he was going to convey to the students. He read monotonously, mechanically, as if he was reading from a piece of paper, which it seems had never happened to him before. The point was that the man was simply afraid that without a cheat sheet, he would begin to swim in a subject he seemed to know by heart. His thoughts, however, were far away from this audience. While Joe was thinking about Casey and bargaining with himself, he wondered if he should ask the girl's classmates if they knew where Casey was. Just as a joke, as if inadvertently, something along the lines of, "Why has it gotten so quiet in the last few classes?" Eh? Casey? No, I hadn't noticed. I don't know why she's skipping class. After all, it's perfectly normal for an instructor to wonder why the student isn't attending class. But at the same time, it seemed to Joe that if he opened his mouth and said her name, even in passing, everyone would immediately guess what he felt for her. He even realized the absurdity of such an assumption, but he couldn't do anything decisive about his fear. On the other hand, he wanted so much to know where she was and what she was doing now. Were they ever destined to see each other again if she decided to leave the university? So in a way, that was a good thing. After all, then he would be breaking absolutely nothing if he started a relationship with her. After all, Casey had already turned 18. So everything would seem to be within the law. And as for the age difference, well, it's not like that. It's not like it's 20 years. Casey, for example, doesn't seem to be bothered by it at all. So then why should he be worried about it? She's an adult and has the right to decide for herself who she wants to date, and what if her choice falls on someone like him? He's not that old after all, and Casey can go to some other university. I mean, they're supposed to be one of the best, but they're just one of the best. He could help her prepare and get into maybe even a more prestigious institution. She is, after all, not a boy. For her, losing a year is not any kind of problem at all. What are you thinking? Are you an elderly fool at all? Unexpectedly, his inner voice interrupted his thoughts. Who knows who fell in love with whom? You know perfectly well that nothing good will come out of it. At best, she will find a young and handsome in 6 months. At best. And what a scandal if someone finds out about it, even if she doesn't go to school here anymore. Forget it. But it was easier said than done. Insistent girl did not want to leave his head, no matter how much his mind tried to cope with the sudden influx of feelings. He couldn't do anything about it. Perhaps he just didn't know how to fight such things. After all, it was unnecessary before. That's why the corresponding mechanism had not developed. Anyway, by the end of the lecture, Joe wasn't thinking about whether he should wonder why Cassie hadn't been in class for weeks. His thoughts were focused on how exactly to ask about it. And after going through a bunch of options, he settled on the one he found most innocuous. Just at that moment, the bell rang. Everyone, of course, immediately rushed out. The school rule of ringing the bell for the teacher did not exist within the walls of the university. Besides, Joe's class was just before lunch, so the excitement in the classroom was understandable. Young people, the teacher said loudly. Would you hold up, please? I have an important announcement to make. The next class will be held in the format of a seminar. The audience was buzzing with excitement, and it became impossible to speak. Everyone was talking excitedly about the news, trying to figure out how good it was. No one had ever conducted a seminar on their course, and everything would be all right, but everyone noticed that Joe began to behave strangely. For example, today he ruined the lecture with some boring, incomprehensible nonsense. Would he be able to do that at the seminar? The rector waited patiently until the hum died down a little and continued his thought. He had not yet said the most important thing that he had started this whole thing for. Please tell the absentees that attendance at the seminar is mandatory. Without it, they will simply fall behind in the program and are unlikely to be able to continue their studies adequately. Absentees? Is that Casey? Someone shouted out. And her too, nodded Joe, as coldly and indifferently as possible. Well, she's the only one missing. Antigon. Well, I don't follow you, the teacher said in the same dismissive tone. My business is to bring you information, and what you do with it is your concern. However, his heart was pounding so frantically. What did this guy mean when he said that Casey wasn't the only one he was hinting at? Had he guessed something? No, he couldn't have. Besides, he doesn't have any proof. Not yet, huh? But he might soon. Especially if you don't think, said Joe's inner voice. This time, however, he didn't listen to it. Very soon, all other thoughts were out of his head with one single consideration. Soon he would see her just a week wait, and he would be able to inhale the smell of her perfume again, admire her graceful figure. Very soon he would be able to tell her that he thought about her words and realize that he actually reciprocated her. If, of course, she would come to the seminar, maybe not even come at all. He was sure she would be given the information anyway. But would she realize that it was a personal invitation? And if she did, would she want to respond to it, and how to determine whether she understood or not? She might not show up simply because his hint was too subtle. Well, he can't, after all, act more bluntly. She's a smart girl, she should realize that. But if she doesn't, then how to look for her? What should he do in that case? Maybe find her phone number. The dean's office must have it. Or maybe we should stop worrying and leave the girl alone. The inner voice intervened again. Joe brushed it off again as if it were a pesky fly. It was an absurdly intelligent voice, so reminiscent of his father's, and it had governed his actions for most of his life. Maybe that was why he'd never fallen in love before he met Casey. Maybe that was why the feelings were so strong and all-consuming now. The next week was very difficult for Joe. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, and hours into days, and it seemed that it wasn't 7 days he had to wait, but an eternity. At some point he even thought that he would not live to see the cherished meeting, but he immediately dismissed these thoughts, reminding himself that in fact it was not long to wait, and here came the cherished Tuesday. Trying not to give away his joyful excitement, Joe habitually entered the classroom. Everything was unfamiliar. The students were diligently seated in their seats and froze in tense anticipation. They seemed to be as excited as their teacher, but about something else entirely. They were all waiting to see what the rector had in store for them. All except Casey. She wasn't in the room. Trying not to let his disappointment show in any way, Joe walked behind the pulpit without a cheerful mood, as if nothing had happened. He handed out the practical assignments to the students. He sat down and went about his very important business. He tried to keep at least a neutral expression on his face, or at least not to cry in front of everyone. Now he seemed to understand exactly what was happening to poor Casey as she stood in the middle of his office, weeping bitterly. Well, that settles it. The inner voice stretched out contentedly. Now please remember that you're a teacher. Stop looking down your nose and do what you're supposed to do. And this time Joe thought the voice was right, of course. He started walking between the desks, checking to see how the kids were doing. Occasionally he praised someone or helped someone who wasn't doing well. His comments became more and more useful and informative. The students were pleased to notice that their old teacher seemed to be returning to them, sincerely passionate about his work. Joe reached the end of the classroom and leaned over the experience of one of the students, either prompting or explaining. And at that moment, he heard the front door creak, turned around and felt his heart freeze in his chest for a moment and then beat with accelerated force. Though with his mind, he didn't expect to see Casey. But it was Casey, in her unchanged deep neck blouse, with her hair slightly shot, panting as if after a long run. For a few minutes, she just stood in the doorway, apparently trying to get her breath in order, and then she fixed her hair and clothes and immediately found the rector's gaze unmistakable. "Joe, sorry I'm late. The train was delayed. May I come in?" She spoke in a rapid-fire voice, and of course she did. Not that without waiting for an answer, but even before she had time to finish the sentence. She sat down on her seat in the front row, which no one took. Few people wanted to sit right in front of a teacher, even one as nice and understanding as Joe. "Hello, Casey, come in. We're doing a practical assignment here, so I'm sorry, as a latecomer, you don't have much to choose from." "That's all right," Casey said cheerfully. "I'm sure you can help me with any assignment." The rest of the seminar was just like before, fun and informative. Now, not only the excellent students, but also the most inveterate bad students did not fall asleep on their desks, but listened to the teacher. Each of them conducted a number of very entertaining experiments, and everyone was satisfied. No one realized exactly what had been going on with Joe the past few weeks. "Must be the fall depression," one of the students suggested. "Or professional burnout. That's what happens to very passionate people with expertise." Another answered him, "How do you know?" Questioned the first one. "It's how I got into the biology department, and before that I spent 4 years studying 14th century French poetry. But then we were lucky that Joe just moped around a bit and didn't go to study it instead of you." Laughed the third. Meanwhile, the teacher had managed to discreetly place a note on the desk, inviting the girl to drop by his office in the evening. Without even looking at the note, she smiled understandingly at Joe, as if she knew exactly what it said. Or perhaps she did. It wasn't hard to guess, really. The rest of the day, however, added to the rector's anxious thoughts. What if she didn't come or came, but only to say that she had already gotten over her crush? Or maybe she had not really fallen in love at all. She had just imagined it. She took quite ordinary respect for an older comrade for some sublime feeling. And now she figured it out. Well, in that case, he will only have to accept her choice and probably spend the rest of his life in proud solitude, because where else he will find such a beautiful girl like her? What do you know about her that's so great? Well, except for the size of her breasts, which she shows off to all comers. This time the intonation of it in her voice was a little too caustic, but the rector didn't care anymore. There was a knock on the office door as timidly and carefully as the previous time. A minute later, Casey was sitting on the edge of Joe's desk. "Joe, I can call you Joe now, can I?" She cooed. "Just in private. You do realize that our relationship is against the uni's bylaws, don't you?" "Of course I do. Honey, don't worry about it. So what was I saying?" "Oh, yeah. I'm so glad you finally figured out how you feel and reciprocated. I was in so much pain, I thought it would never happen. Oh, by the way, about the charter." Joe tried to return to the subject, which, now that the separation was over, suddenly came to the fore. "Maybe you'd like to go to some other university. I can help with that. Then we wouldn't have an ethical problem, which, frankly, I'm pretty worried about." "No, I came here on my own and without a tutor, and I'm going to study here too. Plus, this way we can see each other every day. Isn't that great?" "Of course it's great." Joe stretched out with some doubt, which of course could not go unnoticed by his now girlfriend. She pouted her lips, and her expression turned resentful. The man realized that she was about to cry again. He wanted to say something to her, to cheer her up somehow, but he still didn't know how best to do it. And while he was thinking, she spoke first. "Don't you want to see me every day?" "Of course I do. But you see, I'm still very concerned about ethical issues. Maybe if you don't want to leave the university, I should. I'll get a job somewhere else. It's no problem at all." "You're not listening to what I just said about seeing each other every day. You still don't want to." I do. Joe said, trying to look as cheerful as possible. "All right, honey, if it's that important to you. We're not going to change anything. You have no idea how important it is to me." Casey murmured. These were truly wonderful times for Joe, full of exciting new discoveries. He'd never thought that a love affair could be of any interest. In fact, he honestly looked down on couples in love. People had nothing better to do than to walk around all day with each other hand in hand and talk about all sorts of "I'm sorry, I can't do that. It's not the way I was raised. You know, in the old days, it wasn't like, you went straight to bed. Don't think I'm judging. I just can't do it. Just give me a little more time." "All right." Casey sat there with her lips pouting. Joe realized he was hurting her with his rejections, but he hoped she could understand him and accept his positions. After all, there was really nowhere to hurry. Besides, he had complied with all of Casey's other requests rigorously and hoped for leniency in this plan, which was really a matter of principle to him. Besides this doubt, which he openly voiced to the girl, he had many others. For instance, he had never been with a woman before, after all. So how would he explain that to her? And how would he even look in bed in his almost 40s without any experience, especially since, as far as he was concerned, Casey had had just that kind of experience. He really didn't judge her, but he couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious about it. Besides, Joe was still interested in the ethical question they'd never closed. He was really risking a lot by dating Casey, and was kind of balancing on the edge of what was permissible, not allowing himself to cross the last line. Though, of course, that argument was so-so. It was clear that the girl would certainly not agree to wait with this case until the moment when she graduated from the university. Joe himself, of course, would wait until then, even without the walks and restaurants. What he certainly wasn't going to tell Casey about was the fact that he had been in a state of extreme nervous tension almost from the very beginning of their relationship. He felt like everyone around him knew about their affair and looked at him with disgust and judgment. They just didn't have enough convincing evidence to nail him to the wall and kick him out of his native university in disgrace. And then, of course, any road to teaching will be closed to him forever. Of course, he'd still have Casey. But in that case, How will he feed and clothe her, take her to restaurants, buy her presents? Janitors don't get paid enough money to afford all those luxuries, and he can hardly find another job if their affair becomes known. It's only Casey, and if they ever have children, it will immediately increase the cost of 3 times, or even more. And where, you ask, where to get all this money, as she will study, and he will be unemployed? But he was sure that in that case he wouldn't have any Casey left. Why would she want him so old and poor? The flavor of romance that shrouded his professorship would dissipate the moment he lost it, and everything would be ruined. Understand at last, asked the inner voice with some sympathy. The first and brightest, week-long crushes were in the past, and Joe suddenly realized his prospects clearly. More precisely, the complete absence of them. No matter how hard he tried, he was a loser either way, but as bitter as it was to admit it. If he continued his relationship with Casey, the loss would become much more serious. He started to think, time to end this ridiculous story, which had already dragged on far too long as it was. And how could he have given in to ridiculous emotions and made this whole mess with his own hands? And now he's having a hard time cleaning up the mess. And yet, you see, a smart man, Professor. Of course, that didn't mean he'd fallen out of love with Casey. No, he still cared about her. He was still just as bored when parting and just as happy when he met her. He still wished he could spend the rest of his life by her side. Only now he could clearly see that all of this was nothing more than dreams that were never meant to become reality. And if only she had been less stubborn, if only she had agreed to let one of them leave the university. But she stood her ground firmly. No one was going anywhere from the university, period. He'd had this conversation with her more than once. Tried to explain something, to prove something, it was all in vain. The excuses were different every time, but she didn't want to hear about leaving for different educational institutions. Joe couldn't understand why she was so stubborn. But Casey, it seemed, could not realize that she was leading their relationship to the very edge of the abyss, into which the rector would inevitably fall. The whole affair would not be good for either of them, though it would not be as fatal to her as it would be to him. Joe went on for some time, until at last he came to the conclusion that there was no other way out. No matter how painful and hurtful it was, the relationship would have to be broken, and the sooner the better. In addition, there was another unexpectedly disturbing circumstance that pushed the rector to make this difficult decision. The thing was that the first session in Casey's life was approaching, but she did not want to prepare for it at all, as if she did not understand the importance and responsibility of the upcoming exams. On the contrary, she began to demand that Joe spend almost all his free time with her, which had never happened before. And she only waved him away when she heard him suggest that they study together. Well, thought Joe, the girl's brain had gone completely out of whack. No, we have to break off this relationship, and as soon as possible, otherwise not only me, but also she is at risk of dropping out of the university, and study is more important than anything else. Besides, if we break up now, she might find a decent way to shrug her out of unpleasant emotions. And someday when she's older, she'll understand me and maybe even be grateful to me for this step. In spite of all these thoughts, it was not easy for Joe to make up his mind to take any action. However, overpowering himself, he still said one evening, when they once again walked in the park, "Honey, I need to talk to you very seriously." "What's the coincidence?" She responded in a strange tone of voice. "I need to talk to you too." Joe was startled and even somewhat alarmed by the phrase. In his memory, Casey had never been prone to particularly serious conversation, and then there was that strange tone of voice that he couldn't quite make sense of. Nevertheless, he decided that his curiosity could wait. A message from the girl could hardly be more important than his own. "Casey, please listen to what I have to say first. It's very important to you, and try to understand me." "Speak already." A little irritated, the girl replied. "You see, the thing is that I made a willful decision. Do not think that it was given to me easily. It wasn't. But I have come to the conclusion that you and I need to part. I'm sorry, I love you very much, but it's the best thing for both of us." "What decision have you made?" Casey's sudden laughter. "Willing? Where'd you get the willpower all of a sudden?" "What do you mean?" Joe asked, offended. "I mean that if you had that very thing you said, you wouldn't have started dating me, wouldn't you? But you did. I didn't even think it would be this easy. Just 10 minutes of crying and then not showing up to your classes for a month, and that's it. You fell in love like a 6th grader, and now you're gonna tell me how to make strong-willed decisions. Casey, I know you're hurting and hurting right now, but why would you do that? I'll admit I was a little weak back then, and I should have let it go. You see, this relationship was a big mistake from the start. It's interfering with your studies, and I'm walking on the edge. And if this keeps up, pretty soon I'm gonna fall off the edge. It's inevitable, you know? I'm gonna fall in and I'm gonna take you with me. No, honey, we can't go on like this. You're going to be hurt and offended now, Grandpa. A naive man like you, and a professor, a university rector. How could you think that such a spectacular girl like me could be interested in such an old grunt like you? It's disgusting to stand next to you. It's a good thing you fought back so hard. You know why? Otherwise, I don't know how I would have survived it. On the other hand, the collection would have gained a very significant specimen. What collection? Casey, what are you talking about? What is this all about? Or are you just saying mean things to get back at me for breaking up with me? No, are you kidding me? You're really falling for the whole unhappy student in love thing. Casey marveled. I can't believe it. And now you've decided to play the noble knight and dragon in one person. To save the lady from herself, so to speak. Well, that's commendable. It just makes things more complicated. You could have continued to enjoy your fairy tale. It didn't take much. What did you want from me? Joe was dumbfounded by the torrent of filth that Casey had unleashed on him. But what was worse, he slowly began to realize that it wasn't a reaction to his words. Or rather, in a way, of course it was. But it wasn't that she was upset about breaking up with him, but rather that he disrupted some far-reaching plan of hers by suggesting this very breakup was too badly timed. And you don't realize it yourself. She snorted. What could a biology student possibly want from a university rector? Joe thought seriously about this question, missing even the insults towards his home faculty. But everything that came into his head seemed somehow petty and frivolous, simply not worth going to any complicated schemes for the sake of it. And to tell the truth, to such sacrifices, it must be very hard to be around a man who disgusts you so much, who so honestly pretended to have the warmest feelings for him. Was it really all about the credits? Dumbfounded, he stretched out. That's why you didn't prepare for the session. You thought I'd give you a failing grade just because we're dating you. Do I look like the kind of person who would do that? I realize now that you're not, but when I was making it up, how was I supposed to know? Besides, Grandpa, you're thinking too small. For starters, I assumed you weren't the only one who gave me a machine gun. You're not just some teacher. You're the chancellor. Whatever you say, that's what they'll do. Isn't that right? Even assuming I agreed to it, how would I explain it to the ethics committee? You realize they'd be interested in treating one of the students special. What's my problem with that you'll have to deal with on your own? And then we'll move on. And one day I'll be transferred to some normal department. You know, law or economics. You can do that too, can't you? Why did you suddenly switch to the present tense? Joe asked suspiciously. All your Napoleonic plans are definitely in the past now. And yes, just out of interest. Why did you go to biology if you don't like it so much? But I knew you'd be lecturing to the first year class there. Besides, I could get the necessary passing grades with the help of a friend in the admissions office. As for my plans, unfortunately for you, they are still in effect, just a little adjusted. It's a shame that we didn't. But the ethics committee is enough with what we had. You can rest assured, every step of the way is recorded. If you don't believe me, I can provide proof. So, you're going to blackmail me? Why are you being so rude? I'm making you a business proposition. I want you to get me into a normal department and graduate. And in return, I'll destroy all the dirt I've collected. Everybody wins. Joe didn't listen to anything else. Casey yelled something after him for a long time. He was as if stunned, blinded by the revelations that had come upon him. The worst of which was the expected fact that Casey had never really loved him. He had not yet had time to fully realize the grave danger he was in. All his thoughts were occupied only with the fact that the only girl in his life turned out to be fake. But that was to be expected. He knew from the beginning that such miracles simply do not happen. Fairy tale princesses don't fall in love with fairy tale monsters, but the old fool believed it. He couldn't even think that she could deceive him, use him for her own selfish purposes, and then throw it away like a broken toy. He couldn't believe that he was such a poor judge of character that he could be so easily charmed by Casey's good looks. He couldn't see her vile essence behind her, that he could love a girl who was actually worse than any monster. And worst of all, he realized he still loved her. Now that he certainly understood about her, Absolutely none of the feelings had gone away, and that was another shocking revelation for Joe. He had assumed that such shocks should cure a great love once and for all. But there was nothing like it. He realized that he would love and miss his Casey for a long time to come, no matter how silly and horrible it sounded. The man himself didn't notice when he waddled to his house, woke up near his own driveway, and wondered how he managed it at all. He looked around, looked at his watch. It was still light when they said goodbye, but now it was darkness. The hands on the dial told him it was 11 o'clock p.m. It would be at least 5 o'clock hours to walk to the park to his house. He must have been wandering somewhere in the city all this time, immersed in his own thoughts. And it must be said that this long walk had a very favorable effect on the man. The pain, of course, did not go away completely, but it receded a little, giving way to more rational considerations. Joe finally remembered the main content of their last meeting, the ultimatum the girl had given him. It had to be dealt with somehow, and it had to be dealt with urgently. He could stay not only without a job, but also with a terrible reputation among colleagues and friends. After all, what this lady will be in retaliation for him to present everything as if it was he forced her into a relationship. And what's worse, she will be believed, despite all his merits and achievements. Joe thought about this difficult question not only all night, but all the next day. Then at last, he could fall into a disturbing shallow sleep, but after sleeping only a little, he began to think again about the problem he had. Going over it from every angle, looking for a solution, but no brightness was visible. None of the thoughts that came into his head were acceptable to him. A painless way out of this situation simply did not exist, and accordingly, no matter how hard he struggled, he could not find one. It would be good to act according to the situation, according to justice. Only it was not possible. He was ready to bear his punishment because he was guilty of it. In that case, too, his soul demanded that Casey be punished, not because of any petty vindictiveness, but just because it would be fair. Finally, Joe had to accept that there was no way around it without a deal with his own conscience, however small. Gathering his strength, he picked up his cell phone and dialed the number. Casey answered almost instantly. It was as if she'd been waiting for his call. For a second, Joe thought the conversation in the park had been just a bad dream, that they were still doing well and would only get better, that they would find a solution to their ethical problem together, one that would make everyone happy. "Hi, Grandpa," cheerfully said from the phone such a dear and favored voice. "I knew you would make the right decision. You're the one who is so smart. Let's clarify all the details once again so that I with my old brain did not forget anything. So you have some compromising material about our relationship that you lured me into for your own selfish purposes. Is that correct? How straightforward are you?" "On the whole, yes, of course. I wouldn't want to phrase it that way. You're offering me to give you a smooth academic experience, automatic grades in all subjects, and then a transfer to another department and the same trouble-free graduation. And in return, you promise to destroy all compromising videos you have, right? You have an excellent memory for a man of your age. And your brain's pretty smart, too. Yeah, Grandpa, you got that right. And I take it you're calling to agree to my terms." "No, Casey." He took a more businesslike tone. "I was the one who called you exactly what I said, to clarify whether I had correctly memorized the details of what you called a business proposal. As I recall, you gave me a week to think about it, and it's not over yet, so I still have time. You don't have much left, Grandpa." Casey's tone went from cheerful and friendly to aggressive. "Think, Grandpa, think. The clock's ticking. I'll wait for your call." Without saying goodbye, and without waiting for more details, she hung up the phone. Looking at the phone, Joe suddenly smiled. So far, his plan was going well. True, the hardest part of it remained, and he needed to make one more phone call far more unpleasant than the one he had just finished. The next morning, he got ready for work with the utmost care, put on his best suit, combed his hair properly. Not that he usually went around in tattered rags and with his head unwashed for a week. It was just that right now, it was especially important to look not just good, but flawless, so that there was nothing to pick on. Joe knew for sure that he would be looking for such reasons for petty nagging very carefully. 2 stout men dressed in black were waiting for him at the entrance to the university. Without any argument, he gave them his pass and followed them into one of the basement classrooms. There, 10 people had already taken their seats. The Ethics Commission. This was his court, and it was in full force awaiting the criminal who had appeared before them to confess. So, one man began, coughing. You, Joe, informed us last night that you had become aware of a violation of our university's code of ethics. That's right, Joe said calmly. You also claimed that said violations took place over a period of 2.5 months between a faculty member and a student named Casey. Yes, that's exactly what I'm alleging. Although, to be fair, I should point out that I'm not sure of that number of months, maybe a little longer or a little shorter. It's not that important. Much more interesting is what you reported about the identity of the person who engaged in an unstated relationship with the student. I'd like to think I was wrong. Alas, you were right. The offense in question was indeed committed by me. But again, let me be clear. There was no intimacy between us. Just romantic outings and such. You know, one of the women in the audience spoke up. I didn't expect this from you, Joe. No one expected this from him. Another one of the audience confirmed. Although the fact that he came to us to confess is quite his style. You also made another statement. The chairman of the committee began again. One that relates to the situation we're discussing. Allegedly, student Casey sought you out to use you for credit, and when you decided to end the unholy relationship, she blackmailed you with some dirt. That's right. What kind of dirt? Let me ask you something. Honestly, I have no idea. I haven't seen anything. The former chancellor confessed. Some photographs from our dates, I suppose. Maybe tapes of conversations. Probably my letters to her. We exchanged paper letters. You see, I thought it was real. I was trying to be romantic with the girl. Of course, that doesn't absolve me of any responsibility, but I'd like her to get her share of that responsibility for pedagogical purposes only. I see. Is there any way you can prove what you're saying? I can. Joe nodded. Searching through his pockets, he took out an old smartphone, which he hadn't used for a long time, as he had bought more modern models. Swiping his finger across the screen a few times, he turned on the recording of his conversation with Cassie from yesterday. As those present listened to it, their faces took on increasingly surprised expressions. That's definitely Casey's voice, said one of the people present when the tape ended. I know their class, they go to my lectures. Wow, seemed like such a nice girl. How on earth did you, Joe, get yourself into such a mess? What are we going to do with you now? What to do? Joe sighed. Dishonorably discharged, as the bylaws suggest, but I insist that the student Casey be expelled from the university as well. I think you will all agree that she didn't come here to gain knowledge. In addition, I suggest we initiate a background check on her so-called friend in the admissions office. I don't know who that is, but it's clear that person has violated the charter as much as I have. Well, you're right, as always. The only thing that I think, that dismissal with disgrace in your case is not necessary at all. Considering your merits and your perfect characteristic in the university, you, of course, will not stay, but we will not make this story public. Unless, of course, it comes to our attention that a similar story has been repeated or that you have been involved in something similar before. Do you think that would be fair? Absolutely. Joe replied. He couldn't believe his ears. Well, if the chairman of the ethics committee had suggested it, it would be silly to argue with him. Then I'll go. The rector asked shyly. Where to? The chairman frowned. To write a letter of resignation. I understand you plan to do just that. Yes, but not right now. I remind you that you are acting rector of this university until the end of the year. We're not going to have a fire sale over some misunderstanding. In addition, I must also remind you that while you are at this institution, you are also the spokesperson for the Ethics Commission, and somehow I didn't notice you taking minutes of this meeting. So please be kind enough to fulfill your direct duties. The next day was Tuesday, and Joe, though he had a happy ending, went to his freshman pairing with some trepidation. He didn't know if Cassie had already been informed of her expulsion. If they had, he had nothing to fear. But if not, then she'd probably be in the auditorium. And who knew what tricks he could expect her to pull? Casey was indeed in class. Moreover, she took her usual seat right in front of the teacher's nose. She was extremely pleased with herself and occasionally cast meaningful glances at Joe. He tried to ignore all these antics, which was not so easy. Among other things, the mere sight of Casey still caused him unbearable pain. Not to mention the fact that she was sitting right next to him. You could reach out and touch her, and she was acting as normal as if nothing had happened. And they were like two conspirators still keeping a secret together. From her point of view, though, That was probably true. She didn't know anything about the ethics committee meeting or the decision she'd made, and she was sure that since Joe had started calling for clarification, he was almost ready to agree to her terms. How uninterested do you have to be in the person you spend so much time with? Albeit for completely self-serving purposes. He thought involuntarily, did she really think he could agree to this grand con she was proposing? That he was so clinging to his position that he would do anything to keep it. It was obvious, however, that she had never really thought of anyone but herself. And all others, accordingly, measured by the same yardstick. And then a very bad thought occurred to Joe. Those pictures and letters and whatever else she had. Casey still had them, which meant that the ethics committee's bright idea of keeping them secret had failed completely. She's not going to let the man she thinks ruined her life go unpunished. We'll disclose that between them was literally everything. From the teaching job, we'll certainly be able to say goodbye. Fine, I'll go into science. I'll tutor after all. There are plenty of options. And he continued to teach the class. He wanted to enjoy the last days of his stay at the university and knew that he wouldn't let this insidious girl spoil this bright feeling for him. Toward the end of the class, the dean of the faculty and one of the members of the ethics committee entered the office. Without interrupting Joe, he stood modestly aside, watching the class. Casey was visibly nervous and began to cast suspicious glances at both the teacher and the dean. She really wasn't a stupid girl at all, and she was starting to figure out what was going on. The dean was a busy man, and it was unlikely that he had time to just walk around in other people's pairs. So something's up, and it's something pretty serious. She had always been one of the first to know about any significant events in the life of the university, and as far as she knew, nothing remarkable had happened to any of her classmates lately. Dishonorably discharged, as the bylaws suggest, but I insist that the student Casey be expelled from the university as well. I think you will all agree that she didn't come here to gain knowledge. In addition, I suggest we initiate a background check on her so-called friend in the admissions office. I don't know who that is, but it's clear that person has violated the charter as much as I have. Well, you're right, as always. The only thing that I think, that dismissal with disgrace in your case is not necessary at all. Considering your merits and your perfect characteristic in the university, you of course will not stay, but we will not make this story public. Unless of course it comes to our attention that a similar story has been repeated or that you have been involved in something similar before. Do you think that would be fair? Absolutely. Joe replied. He couldn't believe his ears. Well, if the chairman of the ethics committee had suggested it, it would be silly to argue with him. Then I'll go. The rector asked shyly. Where to? The chairman frowned. To write a letter of resignation. I understand you plan to do just that. Yes, but not right now. I remind you that you are acting rector of this university until the end of the year. We're not going to have a fire sale over some misunderstanding. In addition, I must also remind you that while you are at this institution, you are also the spokesperson for the Ethics Commission, and somehow I didn't notice you taking minutes of this meeting. So please be kind enough to fulfill your direct duties. The next day was Tuesday, and Joe, though he had a happy ending, went to his freshman pairing with some trepidation. He didn't know if Cassie had already been informed of her expulsion. If they had, he had nothing to fear. But if not, then she'd probably be in the auditorium. And who knew what tricks he could expect her to pull? Casey was indeed in class. Moreover, she took her usual seat right in front of the teacher's nose. She was extremely pleased with herself and occasionally cast meaningful glances at Joe. He tried to ignore all these antics, which was not so easy. Among other things, the mere sight of Casey still caused him unbearable pain. Not to mention the fact that she was sitting right next to him. You could reach out and touch her, and she was acting as normal as if nothing had happened. And they were like two conspirators still keeping a secret together. From her point of view, though, that was probably true. She didn't know anything about the ethics committee meeting or the decision she'd made, and she was sure that since Joe had started calling for clarification, he was almost ready to agree to her terms. How uninterested do you have to be in the person you spend so much time with? Albeit for completely self-serving purposes. He thought involuntarily, did she really think he could agree to this grand con she was proposing? That he was so clinging to his position that he would do anything to keep it. It was obvious, however, that she had never really thought of anyone but herself. And all others, accordingly, measured by the same yardstick. And then a very bad thought occurred to Joe. those pictures and letters and whatever else she had. Casey still had them, which meant that the ethics committee's bright idea of keeping them secret had failed completely. She's not going to let the man she thinks ruined her life go unpunished. We'll disclose that between them was literally everything. From the teaching job, we'll certainly be able to say goodbye. Fine, I'll go into science. I'll tutor after all. There are plenty of options. And he continued to teach the class. He wanted to enjoy the last days of his stay at the university and knew that he wouldn't let this insidious girl spoil this bright feeling for him. Toward the end of the class, the dean of the faculty and one of the members of the ethics committee entered the office. Without interrupting Joe, he stood modestly aside, watching the class. Casey was visibly nervous and began to cast suspicious glances at both the teacher and the dean. She really wasn't a stupid girl at all, and she was starting to figure out what was going on. The dean was a busy man, and it was unlikely that he had time to just walk around in other people's pairs. So something's up, and it's something pretty serious. She had always been one of the first to know about any significant events in the life of the university, and as far as she knew, nothing remarkable had happened to any of her classmates lately. But it had happened to her. Of course, no one could know about it, unless the old man, in another fit of righteousness, told someone about their relationship. But if he had, there was no way he could be here, because if anyone found out, he'd be out of the university like a cork. Or had he found a way around it? When the lecture ended, the dean confirmed her worst fears, as she quickly stuffed her things into her bag to leave the auditorium immediately. He somehow stealthily appeared near her desk and spoke quietly but distinctly. "Casey, would you hold up, please? But it's lunchtime. You have no right to keep me in the auditorium after the bell rings, especially now. I won't have time to eat. And you, as the perpetrator of this event, will regret it very much." "Oh well," said the dean gently. "Save your threats. Young lady, you'll need them. And as for lunch, don't worry, you'll have time to eat, but not likely to die of hunger. We'll keep you for a little while." They waited in silence until the rest of the class had left the auditorium. Casey cast glances at Joe. He, for his part, tried not to look at her at all. And in truth, he would have preferred to leave with the crowd of students. But something told the professor that he should stay and listen to the dean, and he wasn't wrong. "Okay, Casey, I don't think there's any point in this comedy. I think you've guessed why you're talking to us now instead of going to lunch with the rest of us. Well, now that I've guessed, can you please explain to me what he's doing here?" She nodded her head at the rector. "Am I the one who should be punished for having an affair with a grown man? You're a fully grown woman yourself, so there's no need to twist things around," the dean said sternly. "Although in the fact that for such things as a rule, punishments for such things get teachers, yes, you are right. However, after reviewing your case yesterday, the ethics committee has decided that in this case you both deserve censure and severe punishment. Joe will resign at the end of the year as soon as he hands over the rectorship to his successor. Quit of his own volition. So what, you just gonna sweep it under the rug? It's an outrageous violation of the university's bylaws, and he can continue to hold all sorts of positions, including high positions in the educational structure. On balance, you're right. Given the circumstances, we have found this compromise to be an acceptable solution, and I suggest the same to you." "To me?" Casey was even more indignant. "Yes, to you. We could of course expel you, and with such a characterization that no university would accept you. No matter how well and honestly you pass the exams, or you can wait for the session, which you will fail quite independently. Since, as I have learned, you have not seen fit to prepare for the exams. But if I fail the session, there will be some very interesting photos on the internet, as well as letters and recordings of the conversation. And then your arrangement with Joe will be over." "Fair point," said Joe. "But unlike you, Casey, I'm willing to go along with it. Then justice will be fully restored." "Well, why would you say that?" "Well, Joe, I'm sure that's commendable and all that, but I think I've got an option that might suit all parties. We have a recording of a certain telephone conversation Joe had, if you wouldn't mind showing it to me." It was only then that the rector realized what his colleague was up to. Fortunately, he had the recorded phone with him just in case. And so it was. He quickly found the recording he was looking for. The man turned it on. He watched Casey's face contort, not without a certain sick pleasure. She hadn't even realized there might be dirt on her too. "And get this," the dean continued as soon as the last line was spoken. That tape could end up on the internet too. You know what I'm saying? I do. In a colorless voice, Casey agreed. She realized that the game was hopelessly lost. She had no choice but to agree to the terms proposed to her. Otherwise, she risked losing much more. Tears even flowed down her cheeks. And for once, Joe was firmly convinced that they were completely real. Of course, his first impulse was to go over to Casey and hug her, wipe away her tears and tell her that everything would be all right and she had nothing to worry about. He held back. It was clear it wasn't his hug, not his comfort. Nor did she need him. Besides, Joe wasn't used to lying. After all, the words he was about to say to her would be an outright lie. Would it be good for her or not? The question, of course, is debatable, but the girl clearly had reason to worry. They all acted exactly as agreed. Casey left the university, flunked her first session. No material compromising Joe has not appeared anywhere on the World Wide Web. The girl realized that it is much more reliable to rely on her mind rather than on cunning. And the next year, honestly passed the exams, entered the law faculty of another university. The dean, who had a record of the telephone conversation, was watching the fulfillment of this part of the agreement. In addition, he was also charged with the mission of finding the punishment of the person from the admission committee who had helped the girl to get into the university. This turned out to be not a difficult task at all. As soon as they started to look through the camera recordings related to the period of entrance examinations, they found a young man, a last year's graduate of the same university. He took bribes almost openly, apparently trusting that no one was watching the cameras anyway. He was fired. In addition, he had to revise the exam results of several people who were found to have brought him money. Some of them conferred their knowledge and remained at the university under the close supervision of the same dean. They were placed on probation, during which they risked expulsion for the slightest misbehavior. Joe, as promised, completed a year as a teacher and rector of the university, and then with unprecedented pleasure, handed over his duties to his chosen successor, writing a letter of resignation. It would seem that it was high time for him to look for a new job. But with this task, he decided to delay. For many years, Joe worked without vacation and during this time managed to acquire some savings. And Joe decided it was time to spend them. For a whole year, he had been resting and at the same time trying to sort himself out, and in the end, found the strength to make a decision that would undoubtedly have caused a real scandal in his family instead of, as expected of him, to get a job at another university, and one where he would again have the opportunity to take the director's chair. Joe packed his things and left for some remote village, where he quietly got a job as a teacher in the local school. The management had no questions. They urgently needed teachers. And if the former rector of one of the best universities in the country for some reason wanted to go to work for them, so be it. There were no fools to dissuade him from this adventurous venture, to everyone's surprise, including Joe himself. He really liked the simple rural life and the work of an ordinary elementary school teacher. He got along with children better than with students. All the classes that studied with him in the future simply adored their class teacher. It took several years before Joe was able to forget about Casey and somehow get over the experience. Along the way, he got a lot of help from one of his coworkers, to whom he eventually told the whole story. Cindy, that was the woman's name. She got it right and didn't judge him one bit. On the contrary, she was as supportive as she could be. It was several more years before they were married. Joe's heart had finally left Casey. It was only now that he realized what true love was, and now you could hardly call the painful feeling he had once had for Casey what it was.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.